We're looking a lot older than we were then.
And we'll kick off with my father, who will introduce today's session for everyone.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Khosh Aamdeed. Ji Aayan. The session we have today and the guests we have today are both from a country with which I in particular, and I think all of you probably, have a very close association despite the distance, and that is Ireland. Why we have this association is because we have both suffered the same fate at the hands of British colonialism. So we have much that is common in the past and hopefully in the future. Our guests today are members of the European Parliament, MEPs, based in Brussels. They are Mr. Mick Wallace on the right and Ms. Clare Daly on the left. And I have asked them to speak today at the Research and Publication Centre to take a critical view of European politics today. And there are many, many weighty questions around that issue at the moment. I don't want to go over the ground that they will cover, but I can tell you that Europe is a troubled place today, and they will explain to you why that is so. So, without further ado, wasting any more time, I invite Mick Wallace to come and speak to us. Thank you, sir.
Hello, how's it going? We're Irish, but we speak mostly English. We were colonized by the Brits for a long time. I've actually been asking some people in Pakistan how they feel about the British. I think ye have forgiven them more than we have. Whether the British, if the British are playing soccer, football, or playing cricket, we're not biased against them. We don't care who beats them. We're members of the European Parliament. We were elected from Ireland. I was elected from Ireland South, which is the southern half of the country, and Clare was elected from Dublin City, which is the capital with about a third of the population. So you ask, why is Europe a troubled place today? Well, there's a lot of reasons for it, really. But I suppose, just to put it in today's context, I suppose we should probably just take a quick look at the war in Ukraine. Now, for 3 or 4 months before the war started, there was an opportunity to make sure that the war didn't start. The Russians made it plain that they wanted an end to NATO expansion, they wanted NATO to retreat, they didn't want Ukraine joining NATO. Sadly, Western powers were not in the mood for compromise. The Americans and NATO wanted the war. From our perspective, that wasn't so shocking. What are the US imperialism and NATO about? But NATO is a war machine. It has nothing to do with peace. It serves the interests of US imperialism, and it serves the interests of the military-industrial complex. NATO was formed in 1949 by the Americans, dragging in the Europeans with them into an organization that would help America to actually monitor and control the European nations, making sure that they serve the interest of US imperialism. Now you might ask, okay, so US imperialism has been at war. The US have dropped a bomb somewhere every day since the end of the Second World War. They have wreaked untold destruction in many parts of the world. They spent more on military defense than the next 9 countries in the world put together. In 1945, there was a famous economist in America giving a talk, and he said, we are 4 to 5% of the world's people, but we have 45% of the world's wealth. And if we want to keep it that way, we're going to need a real strong military. The military adventures of America are directly linked to their financial interests. So, the war in Ukraine, why do they want the war in Ukraine to happen? Why were they so keen to drive a wedge between the European Union and Russia? Well, they have a vested interest in it. Obviously, they want to weaken Russia. They also wanted to prevent the Europeans from buying resources from the Russians so that we'd buy them from them instead. The day after the war started, the LNG, the liquid natural gas lobby in America, wrote to the Energy Department in the White House and looked for 6 concessions in order to fast-track LNG production and the building of more plants to make the LNG gas fit for transport. Right? Within 6 weeks, they were given everything they wanted. We, the EU, now find ourselves paying a lot more for filthy LNG gas from America and agreeing to contracts that some of them won't even start for a few years. We're agreeing to contracts to buy LNG, the filthiest gas on the planet, the most damaging to the environment, instead of the cheaper gas we were getting from Russia. And all for what? The big question is, why are the European Union punishing themselves and their own citizens by agreeing to support a US NATO proxy war? And that's the question we've been asking. And since the war started, we've been fighting for peace, appealing for people from the European member states, people from the EU institutions, to work hard for peace. Sadly, they have done nothing for peace. And to explain to you how bad the situation is in the Parliament, myself and Clare put in an amendment to a resolution only 3 weeks ago, and we called on the EU to explore all avenues with a view to ending the war and bringing about peace. There are 705 members in the Parliament. 436 voted against our peace amendment. 118 of us supported it, and the others abstained. Think about it. 436 voted for war. And our own citizens are suffering, just as ye will suffer here, because the cost of products, the cost of energy, is going to have an impact on us all. So we have a European Union promoting a war by refusing to look for peace, by pumping more and more arms into Ukraine to make sure the war won't stop. On 2 occasions, Zelensky threatened to negotiate with Putin. On both occasions, Boris Johnson was still Premier in England. Boris Johnson flew to Kiev on both occasions to make sure that Zelensky did not negotiate with Putin. And he said to him on one of the occasions, you might want to negotiate with Putin, but we don't. And you will not have our support if you do so. This is madness. The problem for us is that the European Union has become a vassal state of US empire. We are without strong leadership. We have Joseph Borrell, the High Representative for Foreign Affairs. He 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, he compared Europe to a garden and the rest of the world as a jungle. It was a wonderful description of colonialism that they pretend that they've left behind. Only 4 or 5 days ago, he said, we will remember those that were not with us. Pakistan has stayed neutral in the war at the UN, and fair play to Pakistan for doing so. Most of the world's population have stayed neutral. The EU has condemned anyone that stayed neutral. What has happened to this European Union? We are condemning the people who have stayed neutral in a war. If you're not with us, you're against us, as George Bush said. This is madness. This is self-destruction. Where is it going? I told you 436 against 118 voted for war instead of peace. But the European Council for Foreign Relations, a European body, ran a huge research project in June. And they checked in 10 countries. They did a very extensive survey. And they found the main question that they put was, do you prefer peace or that we continue to punish Russia? Over 2/3 of the people of Europe voted for peace. And yet, we have about 80% of the politicians in the European Parliament promoting war. The politicians do not represent their people. Now, politicians in general disappoint. Politicians rarely represent the best interests of their citizens. They're a disappointing breed. And we insist we're not politicians. We just happen to keep getting elected. It's a little different. But it's a huge problem, and we need change. And the politicians are not the ones that are going to change it. If we want peace in the world, if we want to deal with the environmental crisis in the world, deal with climate change, if we want fairness in the world, if we want to eradicate poverty in the world, if we want to stop the rise of inequality in the world, it's the people that are going to have to change it. Because don't expect your politicians to do so. Your politicians serve the interest of big business first, and years second. And it's the same here, it's the same in Ireland, it's the same across Europe, it's the same across the world. Some countries do it better than others, and some do it worse. And right now, Europe is looking at inflation this year of 10%, and God knows what's going to happen again next year. The cost of living and so many people in Europe is going off the Richter scale. And they're not going to get the rising wages to match it. Why, in God's name, are we allowing ourselves to punish our own people in the interest of US empire? And we're seeing the very same thing with China. In the last few years, there's been a huge anti-China rhetoric building in European politics. Now, why in God's name do we want to fall out with the Chinese? We want to get on with everybody. China is now the EU's biggest trading partner. And we have the Americans trying to drive a wedge between us and China. Is it because China are doing bad things? China have not dropped a bomb on any country in 40 years. No bomb in 40 years. And we have a country, the US, who drop bombs every day. The US, since 2001, have dropped more bombs than the rest of the world put together. The US today spends 12 times more on arms than Russia. The EU, who says now that we need to rearm because we're not in peacetime anymore and we're at war. The EU was already spending more than 3 times more than the Russians on arms. Europe as a whole, even including Turkey and Britain, were spending 6 times what the Russians are spending on arms. And now we have our politicians telling us that we need to spend more money on arms. Where's the money going to come from? Where will the cuts be made? The cuts will be made to social services. And the money, the profits, will be made for the military-industrial complex. You would think that NATO and the military-industrial complex were starting to run Europe. They've been running America for a long time, the military people. Defense is the biggest game in town in America for a long time. But now we have the Americans telling their own people that China is a threat to the security of the Americans. China is not a threat to the security of the Americans. China is a threat to America's financial supremacy. So China wants to take, the US wants to undermine China, to undermine its fast-growing financial strength. And they're trying to drag Europe in with it. Our biggest trading partner, China. They're trying to make us fall out with them. And unless we find ourselves with stronger leadership in Europe, we are very concerned about where Europe is going. We're very concerned that our politicians are not catering for the interests of the people of Europe. We're very concerned that peace, diplomacy and dialogue are no longer our priorities, because they used to be. Listen, the European countries haven't behaved well in many places, and during our colonial times we were abysmal, the European countries, one worse than the other. And sadly it hasn't stopped. It's just got taken a different form. The exploitation of Africa by European states today is immense still. Africa has still been impoverished. And they won't like to see the likes of Pakistan getting up onto the same level as them either, or anyone else in this region. They have destabilized this region for no good reason for a long time. But the people, we've got to change our approach, and we've got to stop being so poorly served by the politicians. And I'm sure you probably, I don't know how the media works here, but I know in Europe, in Ireland and right across Europe, mainstream media has been bought and sold. They are part of the problem. They are not part of the solution. We rely on social media to get our message across, because mainstream media is in the pocket of US empire, and that's a big problem. But hopefully social media deals with that. It's got to grow stronger. But using social media, feet on the ground, on the streets, that's what we're going to have to do in Europe anyway, if we want to change it. War benefits very few people, and the people always want peace. I'm going to stop talking, and we'll be looking forward to answering questions, because I don't want to be talking about something that you mightn't necessarily want me talking about, and I'll let Clare Daly say a few words.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've heard from Mick Wallace a perspective that we don't normally hear or read in the media. And that is the perspective of Europe. And a Europe that is divided, a Europe that does not speak in the name of its people, does not speak or make policy in the interest of its people. The war that is going on in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, has pitched all the countries of Europe in the very unlikely position of, as Mick put it, vassal states of the US. US से तुम छठा बन गया यूरोप, अजीब एक सूरत है। यूरोप का सारा तस्वर ये था कि अगर एक तरफ सोवियत यूनियन है और दूसरी तरफ अमेरिका है, तो वो अपने पैरों में खड़ा हो सके। लेकिन आज वो घसीटा जा रहा है अमेरिका के पीछे पीछे, और इस पर तबसरा किया है मिक वॉलेस साहब। अब मैं और वक्त नहीं लूंगा, मिस क्लेयर डेली को इनवाइट करूंगा to come and speak to us on European politics today and its critique.
Thanks very much, and I have to say it is a real privilege for us to be here. I mean, we came here to learn on this trip. We're on a bit of a whistle-stop tour of Pakistan in about 5 days. We've been to Islamabad, Karachi, and now to Lahore. We thought we were going to be listening and learning. We didn't expect to be speaking, so that is an unusual position for us to be in now. But look, we're very happy to answer all questions and really happy. It's very interesting for us. When we arrived in the airport in Islamabad, we happened to be walking through and we met a man who came running up behind us and he said, are you the two Irish MEPs? And we're going, yeah. I think you're great. We will follow what you do on social media. And I'm saying that not to say, oh, we're great, we're big on social media, but it's an indication to you of how small the world has become. So we're members of the European Parliament, a largely unrepresentative body, to be honest with you. We are directly elected in our own countries, but a lot of the power is in the countries and the member states themselves, and Ireland is a very small country on the periphery of Europe. Yet by using the platform of the European Parliament, we've been able to touch the nerve of people in every corner of the globe. And as Mick said, every single day we are contacted by people all over the European Union, outside of the European Union, in Africa and in other countries, calling for peace and justice globally. And what does that tell you? It tells you that the gap between the people in power and ordinary people really is the same everywhere, and those in power have misused it, and the majority of people really are struggling for a way in terms of how we can represent our interests. And you know, when we were in the Irish Parliament, because before we were in the European Parliament, we were in the Irish Parliament, we were very active against militarism, which is a key issue that we want to discuss tonight. And Ireland is supposed to be, and is, theoretically anyway, a neutral country. So we're not supposed to take sides. We take great pride in our peacekeeping history. And actually, Ireland's great UN peacekeeping history and neutrality was marketed to get us a position on the UN Security Council. And we were actually elected onto that, probably because of that. And yet we're there at a time when there's war in Europe, and we have abused that position by rolling over and supporting the US-led, what is now EU narrative in terms of that war. Because as Mick said, the war in Ukraine has caused unprecedented problems for Europe. The war, we would say, of course, is illegal. We condemn it. Russia should not have invaded Ukraine. It is a sovereign country. They shouldn't have done that. And actually, we would say they had options, because a week before the war, the Germans were even saying you can't have peace in Europe without Russia. You have to have peace with Russia, which is true. But once the invasion took place, all of that was gone. Everybody dumbed down. The war was on. And what was the response? Now, normally in a war and under international law, the first thing you think you'd be wanting to do was try and get it stopped. Save lives, end the conflict, and try and have a resolution. Not in this one. That's why under international law and that, you don't send arms into a conflict, because that only escalates it and brings peace further away. But of course, that was the response of the European Union, led by NATO and so on, was to send arms into a conflict and sanctions. And here we have now a war going on for months, millions of people displaced, more than 7 million people displaced into the rest of Europe, into the EU, massive dislocation, food insecurity, global insecurity, and so on. And whose interest is being served by this? Because the arms and the so-called support to Ukraine, if we take the US support to Ukraine, 15 billion euros, is that helping anyone in Ukraine? That money isn't even leaving the United States. It's going into the US arms companies. It's where it's going. And it's the hardware that's going to Ukraine. And those people are being used as cannon fodder, as Mick said, in a proxy war between the US and Russia. And imagine that. And I think people on this side of the world can imagine that a lot more, because this isn't the first war. It's not even the only war at the moment. It's not even the most devastating war that's ongoing at the moment. We had that in terms of Yemen and the starvation of people. Who's calling for arming the people of Yemen? I haven't heard anybody in America asking for that, or in the EU, or the people of Palestine, or any of these. But yet, seemingly now, Russia is a terrorist state, and we have to arm the Ukrainians because that's the best way to defend. This is lunacy. It's benefiting NATO, it's benefiting the US, and it is causing enormous problems for the people of Europe and, in fact, the people of the world, because the European economy now is in severe crisis. It's on the edge of recession. We had a meeting yesterday in Karachi with a company that make jeans, and they do a lot of their business and they supply a lot of the jeans to Europe. But the contracts that they've negotiated are contracts in dollars. So now all the Europeans have to buy their jeans in dollars. So they're squeezing the Pakistani company now because they don't want to pay the inflated levels. So they're driving down prices here, which is having an impact on yourselves. So this is a global village and everyone is suffering in this war. And the saddest thing is that the countries where the majority of the world's population live have seen this lie from the beginning, because your governments and your majority at the UN have voted to keep out of it. You've not involved in sending arms, you're not involved in sanctions. You know that the only way to end it is through peace and dialogue. But unfortunately, the EU has gone alongside and bent the knee. And just to give you one or two other quick examples, one is the issue of energy. And Mick is right, like the US at the start said, and it's an open secret, that they wanted to break the European Union's dependency on Russian gas and Russian energy. And one of the things that happened is the Nord Stream 2 and 1 gas pipelines were blown up, releasing massive amounts of methanes and emissions, an environmental disaster, but an act of gross economic sabotage. And no one's talking about it. No one wants to know who did it. The Western media will tell you, oh, the Russians did that now, as if they go and blow up their own multi-billion euro structure that transports their gas. I mean, come on. Why in God's name would Russia have any interest in blowing that up? And why isn't the West looking for a proper investigation? Because they know full well who was involved in it, and it definitely wasn't Russian. I don't know who it was, but I'd be starting looking now in the direction of the UK, US, or Poland if I was starting anywhere else. But I mean, the bottom line in that is that the people of Europe now are facing a winter where the choice for many of them is between heating or eating. And that's not a lie. There's a huge crisis now. People cannot heat their homes. They cannot buy enough food or anything like that. And then, of course, we have the impact on global food security. So what we have here is a backdrop of massive instability where our whole world is suffering from these events. And to me, the reason why this is so bad is that obviously US power is in decline. China have trumped them economically, but they can't get over that yet. So it's kind of like the last bite of a dying snake. It's the most vicious, and you have to be really careful. Because where is this war going? Because they say, well, it's going to go until Ukraine defeats Russia. That's not going to happen. That is not going to happen. Because if it ever got to the stage where that was likely to happen, at the cost of probably everybody living in Ukraine, then nuclear weapons will be used, and humanity and the world as we know it will be in a different place. So this is the scary juncture that we're all right now, and yet nobody is kind of calling for peace. And that's why I suppose we do get a big following on social media, and that people know us. Sadly, it's for a bad reason, that the voices calling for sense are quite few. And that's why for us, the great hope actually is what we would call the traditionally non-aligned countries, countries like yourselves who've stayed out of it, who represent the majority of the world's population and who have the most to gain out of the ending of this war and a change in the social order as it is. The most to gain from a really multilateral world where people work with their neighbours and trade and do business. Who cares that people want to do business with the Chinese or whoever? If you can come to an agreement that reaches and accommodates everybody, what's wrong with that? That's what we should be doing, is living in peace. Because if we don't sign up to that page, then the only people who are winning is the big multinationals, the big arms companies, and the big people in power who, as time is going on, the gap between rich and poor is getting bigger everywhere we speak, and the instability and the disorientation that people are feeling, that the norms that they thought were there are no longer. This idea of democracy, of certainty, of rights and so on, are fast disappearing, and we live in an order where now we're told you can only think one way. Critical thinking is not to be tolerated. As Mick said, you're either with us or you're against us. That's it. Only show and time. that's not a way forward. That's authoritarianism. That is the beginnings of fascism as far as I'm concerned, and it's a deeply, deeply troubling situation. We should be able to have an exchange of views, to discuss our differences in a mutually respectful way and in a real structure of international law and multilateralism, and that's what's been undermined globally. And sadly, I suppose we bring you a sad tale of a Europe that's on its knees now, whose people are lost and don't know what's going on. We feel we're paying the brunt of this war that we didn't start, which we are, and for no good reason at all. So we've great hope on the rest of you getting your act together and making Europe see sense of breaking from our subservience with the US, breaking the shackles of NATO, and we're really looking forward to the discussion around some of these issues with you. So thanks for being here.